to have Professor Sumana Roy. Let me just formally introduce her and give her the floor. I hope, Swati, you are recording. That's great. Okay, so Professor Sumana Roy is the author of How I Became a Tree, a work of nonfiction, Missing, a novel, Out of Syllabus, poems, and My Mother's Lover and Other Stories, a collection of short stories. She's Associate Professor of Creative Writing in Ashoka University. So over to you, Shumanadi, and thank you so much for doing this again.
Thank you to all of you who are here. Where I am, it's quite a cold morning. As you know, my talk is called Useless. When I shared information about this talk on my social media, many laughed at the amusing circumstance of talking about the useless in a place such as IIT, such as an IIT. One commentator even comparing this with J.K. Rowling giving a speech about failure at Harvard. In the popular imagination, an IIT is a place where nothing useless is done or taught. Some of you might choose to debunk that myth someday. Orko Chattopadhyay, who very gently and kindly asked me to give this talk, decided that he would start today by smuggling in this useless lecture. I'll come to the subject of the useless and its constitution and the ways of looking at it, and how it might be a free gift we have been ignoring as writers from a few unrelated perspectives. The first time I tried to articulate my position about the useless, I think the phrase I used was cultivating the useless. I was on a panel at the U Chicago Center in Delhi. There were two other writers with me on the panel. And amidst all the talk about voice and plot and characters and so on, I just felt that everyone knew everything about everything. But how are we to cultivate the useless that is so essential to writing and to art? I asked them and the audience. I later learned, in the way that gossip travels, that someone was heard saying this in the audience. Only a person from a small place like Siliguri would want to cultivate the useless. There might be some truth in that, perhaps. Those of you who don't know, I'm speaking from Siliguri. I wasn't born here, but I've spent most of my life here, and I wouldn't want to be anywhere else. But the ascription of uselessness to smallness and provincial life, as I was telling Sharmita Lahiri a little while ago, is telling. And I'd request you to keep that in mind as we navigate through the subject. Just this, that some of us might become to be seen as useless just on the basis of our geographical location, where we were born, to whom we were born, how we were raised, and by whom. Let me share with you two of my favorite anecdotes about the useless and their value. Orko might be familiar with them. They are from this book by Ranjan Ghosh and J. Hillis Miller. This book is called Thinking Literature Across Continents. These two anecdotes are from that book. I'm sorry, I'm recovering from COVID and my voice isn't great. I apologize beforehand. The first is from Rabindranath Tagore, who is describing a delightful experience on the river Padma. It was a beautiful evening in autumn. The sun had just set. The silence of the sky was full to the brim with ineffable peace and beauty. The vast expanse of water was without a ripple, mirroring all the changing shades of the sunset glow. Miles and miles of a desolate sandbank lay like a huge amphibious reptile of some antediluvian age, with its scales glistening in shining colors. As our boat was silently gliding by the precipitous riverbank, riddled with the nest holes of a colony of birds, suddenly a big fish leapt up to the surface of the water and then disappeared, displaying on its vanishing figure all the colors of the evening sky. It drew aside for a moment the many-colored screen behind which there was a silent world full of the joy of life. Tagore uses the word anando. It came up from the depths of its mysterious dwelling with a beautiful dancing motion and added its own music to the silent symphony of the dying day. I felt as if I had a friendly greeting from an alien world in its own language, and it touched my heart with a flash of gladness. Then suddenly, the man at the helm exclaimed with a distinct note of regret, "Ah, what a big fish!" It was at once brought before his vision the picture of the fish caught and made ready for his supper. He could only look at the fish through his desire, and thus missed the whole truth. Second is from the Chinese philosopher Zhuangzi. I'm sure I'm mispronouncing, but I don't know. I have no Chinese. Zhuangzi was walking on a mountain when he saw a large tree with huge branches and luxuriant foliage. A woodcutter was resting by its side, but he would not touch it. When he was asked about the reason, he said it was good for nothing. Then Chuangzu said, "This tree, because of its uselessness, is able to complete its natural term of existence." Having left the mountain, Chuangzu lodged in the house of his friend. The friend was glad and ordered his waiting lad to kill a goose and boil it. The lad said, "One of our geese can cackle and the other cannot. Which of them shall I kill?" The host said, "Kill the one that cannot cackle." Next day, his disciple asked Chuangzu, "Yesterday we saw the mountain tree that can complete its natural term of existence because of its uselessness. Now, for the same reason, our host's goose died. Which of these positions would you, master, prefer to be in?" Chuangzu laughed and said, "I would prefer to be in a position which is between the useful and the useless. This seems to be the right position, but is really not so. Therefore, it would not put me beyond trouble." I begin with these two anecdotes, I'm sorry, because they give us a useful way to understand the useless, the usefulness of the fish to the boatman, and its seeming inconsequence to the poet Rabindranath as an artist, and Chuangzu's description of life and death, and the greater chances of survival for the useless. I take you now to an anecdote closer in time and space to my own life from a few months ago, last month actually. We are having tea when my niece, Aki, visiting after more than half a decade, makes a remark about me. Why do Bengalis say cha ta, and not just cha? Cha is, of course, the Bangla word for tea. Aki, whom I call by her nickname Putai, doesn't realize that she's triggered something that will almost take over the evening. Her parents, her two uncles, her brother, and I, and she herself pounds upon the opportunity with unexpected enthusiasm. Bangla, the language, becomes a sport, and we players. Jata, natok tatok. We begin throwing examples at one another. After this list, which shows no sign of retiring, conspiracy theories emerge. My favorite among them is two types. She said, "It plays on ambiguity, I think. Cha is quite specific, the tea. Ta is ambiguous. It means snacks to accompany the tea. One doesn't really know what the items on the menu might be." Her father, by the family's consensus, a TOE, a theorist of everything, of his own kind, wonders whether there is any other language in the world in which such a tendency can be overheard. "No, no," we say in Bangla. "Na, na," almost echoing what we are discussing, the repetition of sounds. Unlike in English, where a single no means no, in spoken Bangla, particularly in domestic and intimate spaces, the negative must come in a pair. We have to say na na. At some point, I share with them the trouble I had with translating a particular line from a Tagore song, "Ghashe ghashe pa felechi." How is one to translate ghashe ghashe? Ghash is grass, as many of you would know. I've stepped on grass, I've walked on grass. None of these translations can capture the rhythm of ghashe ghashe, where the repetition of the word is like an imitation of putting one foot after the other. Ghashe ghashe. At some point during our conversation, much after we'd finished eating, perhaps triggered by the sound of the chocolate wrappers, now they had carried Belgian chocolates for us, unavailable in the small town where we live. Just notice, students, how I smuggled in some useless information. I mentioned Obonindranath to them. One of us must have used the onomatopoeic phrase, "moch moch." Notice this again, the rhyming, moch moch, used for eating something crunchy. My copy of Jorashakur Dhare, I forgot to get a copy of the book to show you, is marked with this, I said every page has at least more than 6 or 7 of these expressions that I have circled with blue or green ink. I've not read anything like that book in my life. I wasn't exaggerating, it was true. I really hadn't read anything like that in my life, which used Bangla in the way that Abanindranath had, with every second or third sentence carrying the sense of this language in it. I call this the moch moch, tata, natuk tatuk. I call it the unexpected echo, this useless repetition, either of the same sound, as in ghashe ghashe, or something similar that rhymes, as in cha ta. It is not about an understanding of the Bangla language or its intestines. I know that many of you here are not familiar with Bangla, and that's absolutely okay. It is about the peculiarity of a temperament. What is one to make of its tendency to repeat, to echo, to become the word and its shadow? Between the word and its echo falls the shadow. I also request you at this moment to think about the Greek myths of Echo and Narcissus and the punishment given to Echo, where only the last sounds of her utterance would be audible. This useless sound that comes from repetition and rhyme perhaps also reveals a temperament that is unsure, tata, hesitant about being specific, as Tutai said, but also excess, ta and ta, what Tagore in a different place called surplus. For a frugal people, this is show, just the Bengalis, and their history of modernity, their history of a language becoming modern, and the attendant history of partition and how it affected them. For a frugal people, this is show or performance of abundance, but also irony. Notice these words, please, with a little more attention than you might my other words, but also irony, critique, that shows that nothing can be taken very seriously or at face value, that there is always addition and subtraction in what follows us, like they do in our descendants, as there is in cha followed by da. This is literary language in its most basic sense, the language of playfulness, of irony, of suspicion, of calling out frauds, of unexpected echoes, of rhyme, of dance, of subterfuge, of hiding, of subtlety, of mimicry, of parody, even of self-parody, of blunder, of caution, of ambiguity, of gain and loss, of sound and meter, of dhwani, in the end, of poetry. This is how poetry is smuggled into a language daily, self-consciously, where every user of the language is allowed to be a poet in this manner, where the anonymous first creators of such pairs live amidst us through language, like they do in folk songs. This is how all of us come to belong to a literary tradition. Please notice how this rhyming pair, which sometimes seems to have the character of the Hindu mantra, find its poetry and beauty in terms of two contradictory things, both surplus and useless. Keshmesh, light tight. So, we import this sensibility even when we are using English words or words from other languages. So we say light tight, chad tad. I began to notice this when my nephew started making up his pairs, repeating every word with a neologistic rhyming sound. He was practicing and cultivating uselessness from the small town with great joy. Sometimes there's also this in Bangla, the repetition of the meaning of the word in the construction. For instance, in chai bhosho, chai and bhosho are both ash, or a peculiarly Bengali phrase, jodi by chance, if by chance, both meaning the same thing. Through difference and repetition, the useless, you can see, brings in poetry and the poetic in language. Now I want to share with you a few thoughts on the useless that have come to us from three very different kinds of artists and thinkers. Just notice that the first two quotes do not use the word useless, the third does, but they nudge us very cleverly to think about a world where the useless doesn't exist, a regimented world of thought and action. The first is from the third Earl of Shaftesbury. He says, the most ingenious way of becoming foolish is by a system. Next is from Stephen Jay Gould. No biases are more insidious than those leading to the neglect of things everyone knows about in principle. The third is from the writer John Banville, who many of you might be familiar with. He says, the artist is the man who has nothing to say. I have nothing to say. I have no opinions about anything. I don't care about physical, moral, social issues of the day. I just want to recreate the sense of what life feels like, what it tastes like, what it smells like. That's what art should do. I feel it should be absolutely gloriously useless. What is this absolutely gloriously useless that John Banville is talking about? When I first began teaching poetry to my students, when I begin teaching poetry to my students, we try to discuss and find out what each of us thinks about the poetic. I find it joyous to discover people as young as you are have been thinking about the poetic. The poetic, mind you, not literally a poem. Quite often they ask me towards the end of the class what I think of the poetic. One day I told them this. Imagine the class photo, your class photo, and a wall full of class photos at your university or the IIT that you are studying in. When your class photo is being taken, yours in particular, your batches, suddenly a crow flies past. The photographer lets the crow remain in the photo. Now, the crow doesn't belong to your class, but it is still in the photo. 20 or 25 or 30 years later, you come back with your family to show them your class photo. And you say, oh, my class photo is easy to find. There's a crow in it. Now, all the other class photos on that wall in that room, they are just simple information. They are bureaucratic. Your class photo is the poetic. It has something useless, the crow. It was not supposed to be there. But because it is there, it has become art. It has moved beyond information. We hear the word intentional and intentionality, particularly if you're watching a lot of American television, quite a lot these days. Such a mindset has its uses, as does the impact of another word, focus. The lack of intentionality isn't completely a lack either. Lack of intentionality, such as the crow coming into the photo, without your intentionality or the crows or the photographers, has come to be constructed as synonymous with uselessness. Let us think of an example where intentionality in art is terribly limited. I'm thinking of something like, say, bird watching or a filmmaker's wait for a particular kind of light for a shot. The wait, what do we want to call it, waiting, is beyond the reach of intentionality. And when judged or measured by such a culture of calibration, any duration of time spent on waiting would be calculated to be useless. Unlike fishing, I'm going back to fishing because of that quote by Rabindranath, unlike fishing, where there might be some material reward to show at the end, one will not be able to explain the joy and purpose of bird watching. And yet we know from our own experience of such or similar activities that they bring surplus of a kind no quantifiably so-called useful activity does. Take reading, an activity that has now been turned from an unpredictable and often joyous experience to a more professional and moral one. One must read, we are told by a variety of people and stakeholders. Parents and teachers want their children and students to read to pass examinations and gain knowledge of the kind that can harvest early success. Writers, such as myself, want readers for an income. Publishers and bookstores need readers for business. Notice how all of us who have some kind of stake or the other in this reading industry have turned to moralizing it. We repeatedly invoke its usefulness, whether for our own selves or for society. We look down upon those that don't read, and we ignore the fact of iniquity completely, forgetting those who cannot read. It is hard in this new exhibitionist economy, where one shares posts of reading a book every week, where there are lists of books to read and one has read on Goodreads, that there was indeed a time when parents scolded their children for reading anything besides their school textbooks. I come from such a family. What good would reading a novel or comics do for me? It would seem like completely different approaches. One encouraging of reading and the other more censorious of any kind of faltu reading. Both are invested in the idea of use. It is useful or useless. Sometimes, though its frequency seems to be increasing with every teaching year now, I meet students who are taking courses in creative writing because they want to be writers, of course. But they have not really read anything outside the text in their school textbooks. And we all know what literature in a CBSE curriculum is like. Reading seems to be a useless activity for aspiring writers sometimes. The relation between the two isn't clearly visible. It's usefulness. Now, as a teacher, I can make a case for practice, for riyaz in writing, like one asks an athlete to keep practicing. How is one to prove that reading, even though seemingly useless to literary output at day end, it doesn't show up in the 500 word count you have promised to write every day, is inextricably related to writing? The useless is hard to argue for because of one obvious reason, as Orko and I were discussing just before. All of you probably arrived on Zoom. The useless is hard to argue because it is not visible. Argue for because it is not visible. The time and actions that constitute a cultivation of uselessness can be seen, but not what I'm arguing for, which is its return, its rewards, because none of this can be measured with a graph. It's like arguing for 8 hours of sleep every day. Sleeping would be, for an ultra-capitalist economy like the kind that races us to its speed, it would be a completely useless activity had the body continued to be efficient without sleep. Reading, listening to music, watching films, allowing the impress of the day to run through you like wind in your hair, instead of trying to tame the day. Loving, crying, laughing, smelling a neighbor's kitchen. These are some of the most basic kinds of uselessness that are necessary to one's life as a writer, as a creator. In this connection, I'd like to tell you about a young man, possibly only a few years older than you, wrote to me last year or maybe 2 years ago, asking about the places that he should visit and the things that he should do so that he could eventually write about it. It was decided that this is what he wanted to do. I don't know whether I could convince him when I told him to just live. One can't go traveling to fixed destinations hoping that material for a novel will come from there, any more than you can go to bed hoping for sleep to come at exactly the moment you want it to. Going in search of material seems similar to going to the archive to find out about a particular trade route or about eating habits of 18th century European travelers. But we know from our experience that living is not like that. This research might be important to your story, but it cannot be its heart. One of the things you might struggle with as a writer is how you can communicate information to your reader. With this, you kind of struggle, all of us struggle. You know that it is necessary that the reader knows what you want to share, but you're not sure it's completely useful either. It's very difficult to write at that, to smuggle information in. So you have to find ways to smuggle this in. Melville found a way to do this in Moby Dick, where you have page after page about whales and the whaling industry. Arun Kolatkar, whom I'm sure Orko will introduce you to at some point of time in your course, did something similar but also very dissimilar. He turned the menu card of an Iranian bakery in Bombay into a found poem. The poem is just a list of things available on the menu of that day. How you manage to do this, that is, smuggle in information. The poem is just a list of things available on the menu, as I said. Now, how you manage to do this, and remember that in doing this, you are giving dignity to the seemingly useless, and therefore your writing becomes allied to your politics as well. How you manage to do this will determine the kind of writer you are. It's dependent on your temperament, both as a person and as the kind of writer you are. Remember, there are some among us who love to carry an inventory of useless information. We've also often been competitive about it, lugging around information to quiz competition. Satyajit Ray's film, Aguntuk, makes this kind of uselessness the axis of its story. So I think you see now how the useless can be turned useful. When I try to search for a metaphor to understand the relation between the useless and creativity, I think of the novel Robinson Crusoe, a novel whose story you have known since you were children. Now, after a few days on the island, Crusoe decides to swim to the ship to find out whether he can rescue any supplies that might be of use to him. He salvages whatever he can. What he manages to get unexpectedly is a supply of writing material, paper and ink, both of which he cannot produce by himself on the island. He begins by recording every single incident of his day in his journal, the number of boats, the things he did, the activities of the sun and the animals, and so on. A few months pass, and he realizes that with no certainty or even sign of when he would be able to go back home, he will have to ration his use of ink and paper. Crusoe is therefore forced to make a choice now. He decides to write down only what he thinks are significant events of the day. The word is his. I read this as a metaphor for creativity. The moment when Robinson Crusoe turns from a journal keeper to an artist. He must, from now on, do what all artists have to every moment, the process of selection and rejection. What we see in the novel is a crisis is about the availability of writing material, but this is actually a crisis about creativity and the proportions between the useful and the useless that a writer, that you as a writer will always have to negotiate. What should I put in? What do I take out? By choosing a word at any moment, I keep reminding my students, you are rejecting all other words in that language, in that dictionary. Just as by choosing someone as your partner, you are rejecting all possible people on this planet who might have been your partner. This choice comes with great responsibility. You have to make it work, both your relationship and the writing, to hold it together. All these words are strangers to each other, like you were to your partner once, like most people getting on a train or plane are, but they come together for that moment, however long that moment might be. The residential certificate of the useless is often pushed to the extra literary spaces in a text. One such space I have noticed is the dedication page. There, the writer might choose in a moment of candor, talk about how a book might have been written at greater speed, add some variation of the useless, a marriage, a relationship, their pressures and demands, not robbed him of his time. I remember an Ashish Nandi book dedication that I can only paraphrase. I couldn't find the book in my house. He had said something like, for Uma and then for his daughter, something like, without whom this book would have been written 2 years ago, but without whom this book would not have been this book. We are conditioned to such a line of thought. about relationships being a habitat of the useless. South Asian parenting involves active discouragement of getting involved in any kind of romantic relationships, and with it, the reading of romances, of songs and poems that trigger these useless feelings. The discouragement of the reading of novels once upon a time and the buying and borrowing of nonfiction titles, and the encouragement of the buying and borrowing of nonfiction titles, particularly those aimed at self improvement, reveal how the idea of the useless and consequently the avoidable decides our reading life and other related choices. When I think of this from my own life, my parents' frustration and anger at the invasion of Archie's galleries and posters of sportsmen and film actors into lives like mine, I also think of Charles Darwin, who, before he chose to get married to his cousin Emma Wedgwood, made a comparative study of the pros and cons of marriage on the back of an envelope. I quote, terrible waste of time. This is one versus, quote, a home and someone to take care of. I think terrible waste of time versus a home and someone to take care of. I think this was in 1837 after spending about 5 years on the HMS Beagle that would take him to various places in South America, as you know, whose impact and usefulness would have been impossible for anyone to judge in 1931, when Darwin, after giving up medicine and theology at university, both disciplines that he had been pressured by his family to take up, set sail on the ship as a naturalist. Darwin could imagine the uselessness of marriage, but not that of half a decade on a ship and the related consequences. I make these comparisons to state the obvious, the male understanding of domestic life as useless to a scientist, to an artist. Such wiring decides on how writers write as well. Why Charles Dickens gets a double door installed in his writing room, keep out the disturbing sounds of domestic life, while Jane Austen keeps her notebook open in her room, to which she disappears for a couple of minutes while in the middle of making breakfast for her large family in her brother's house. An infant's bawling does not generate as much disturbance as an employer's instruction or show of displeasure. It was this model of the important and the useful that Virginia Woolf challenged in a room of one's own when she listed the catalog, various kinds of catalog from Trevelyan social history and things she found in registers at Oxford University. What Woolf was directing us towards was the idea that genres, she doesn't spell it out, this is what I get from her, is that the genres are built around the idea of the useless. What we put in and what we take out, as I've been saying for some time now, decides on the kind of book that we are writing, the kind of genre that we are living in, and the kind of writers we are. One can identify the gendered mind of the author from what they throw out in their writing. But there are other things too. I think the whole idea of genre, particularly as it plays out in writing, owes particularly to the useless. And I don't mean the literary genres alone. Take the horoscope writer. Which horoscope writer will put anything useless in their 150-word weekly account about your sun sign? They have their categories to attend to: finance, job, romance, travel, home. No horoscope writer has bothered to predict that you might get an extra serving of vanilla ice cream. It is a useless piece of detail for the writer, for the horoscope writer. Or take the writer of erotica or pornography. Anything else that is unnecessary to climaxing to the enjoyment of pornography is filtered out as useless. I began making notes about this lecture while watching gymnasts and athletes train on a large field adjacent to a forest. I sat there watching them. What might aliens have made of this? The many, many circles that these young athletes were running on that field. It is possible that they, had they access to an academic register like ours, would have called this activity useless. I watched them from inside the Boikunthapur forest on the outskirts of Shiliguri. And it struck me that for a forest, nothing was useless. This world, plants and trees, the birds on them, the insects around and under me, the little gymnast and athlete, wasn't a useless one. There was nothing useless there. It took me some time to realize that useless was a category that did not exist in a world where the head hadn't been given the highest position in the hierarchy. On your mark, get set, go, or ready, steady, one, two, three, and so on. I heard them say that from time to time. We are a culture that has been conditioned by Samkhya philosophy, the countability of things, and hence our natural gravitation towards judging ourselves and others on the basis of this marker. Tell me, is everything else besides the scorecard useless? Only the number of goals scored, the number of runs taken. And why does our historiography ignore the useless? Why isn't there any space for the useless in which history and its discourses are written, even today in 2021? On my way back from the forest, I was stuck at a traffic signal. A cow, in the manner of all good Indian cows, was crossing the road. It showed complete indifference to the traffic signal. What red, what green? The traffic signal was completely useless to it. And it reminded me of how so much of our codes that derive from the semiotic, the ready-made that we take for granted as naturally as we do breathing and loving, are useless to those who are not literate in those codes. And yet, it is to these codes that we turn often for the beauty, for the poetic, for beauty. It is not hard to see that much of the determination of the indices of what constitutes the useless owes to the inimicality to beauty in our times. Beauty is useless, we are reminded, even if not in words. Think of our older architecture, both of monuments and living spaces, and think of our public spaces today. Contrast the simplicity of the grace of sloping tin roofs and the matchbox structures we live in. We know from this contrast that beauty derives from the seemingly useless. I'm thinking of metaphor and even the simile, their uselessness for all practical purposes. What is the use of a woman's graceful walk or gait being compared to an elephant's walk, tell me, as M.F. Hussain did in Gajagamani? And yet we know, as artists, as writers, even as readers, that beauty is hidden there, in that useless comparison that allows you to see more than the woman and her walk, that it is able to bring two different worlds together, women's and the elephants, as all comparatives do. Also thinking of other useless things, not just alankar or ornamentation, but something more commonplace, like say the nickname, pet name, what we in Bangla call the dark now. How much of history is hidden in the nickname? My husband's niece reminded me of this at her wedding when I called her by her nickname. She said, Mommy, only 3 people remain who still call me by that name. The rest are dead and gone. The surplus and the history hidden in that seemingly useless name. Surplus is also in saying something twice, in the poetic refrain. And therefore, I kind of went to Bangla to show about how repetition and refrain and rhyme are also about the useless. So, in the poetic refrain, for example, how surplus lives, in Robert Frost saying, miles to go before I sleep and miles to go before I sleep. Saying it twice might be considered useless. Useless piece of information about miles to go before one can sleep, and then saying it twice uselessly. But we know what that does to that poetry, to that piece of uselessness. I have always felt myself gravitating naturally towards the useless. I remember that a classmate used to always leave his lunchbox open inside his school bag. I do not know why I remember this about my friend Shubhobrata, but I do. Someday I'll find out, perhaps. It has directed the way I live, love, look out, look away, teach, read, and write. With a couple of friends from that time, I set up a journal called Anti-Serious. It was to challenge the idea of the serious and the useful. Sorry. I find that much of what might be called my creative engagement has been in trying to give the useless a seat at the table, as it were. In How I Became a Tree, I wanted to write about a life of plants and their metaphorical possibilities beyond the bureaucratic save trees to save the planet. In other words, beyond the useful botanical. In Missing, the novel that Orko just showed you on his screen, um, I wanted to put parallel narratives on the page. Newspaper reports about a riot-torn region in Assam versus the useless conversations between a carpenter, his helper, a cook, a driver, a blind poet, and so on. What form can this negotiation between the useful and the useless take? How do they feed on each other? In Out of Syllabus, my collection of poems, I was, as you can make out from the title itself, putting myself outside the useful category of the syllabus. In My Mother's Lover and Other Stories, I tried to write about people who suffer from uncommon and perhaps useless ailments. A woman's fear of plastic, another's obsession with water in Darjeeling, someone else's obsession with literature, with sleep, as Orko told us, word games in a picnic, and so on. My politics lies in making a case for the useless. And that is why, about a year ago, I wrote an essay on the post colonial syllabus. Why the novels, and notice that it's mostly novels, taught in it an homage to the useful and the serious, of what is called matters of national and international importance. How domestic life and the life of those like myself who come from the provinces were meant to be only in the background, how all of these, how our love lives and our daily frustrations were not given place in such a syllabus. In the courses that I teach, I find myself happiest when I teach forms that are not taught in most creative writing programs. Two of these, for instance, are letters and the interview. I mean, I think about it. You meet many who are working on their first novel, and being a novelist seems like a useful occupation today. But you will not meet anyone in these curricula who have come to learn how to write letters and interviews as literary forms. And yet, I find that a community's subconscious, because of its relationship with uselessness, are held in these minor forms. I could have ended this lecture thanking you for sitting through my useless lecture on the useless. But given how much I have praised the useless, it would seem like I'm praising myself. So I'll just say thank you, and I wish you a useless day. Know that what air doesn't need falls to the ground, thereby becoming useless for air. All that is useful and useless, whether or not it is bright and beautiful, stays on earth, this habitat we all share. So be useless. And because you are students in an institute of science, let me end by reminding you of the useless apple that is supposed to have fallen on Newton's head. Think of how poor we would all be without that useless apple falling on Newton's head when he was spending time uselessly. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Shomanadi. That was wonderful. And those tensions between the useful and the useless, and not wanting to always make the useless into useful in fiction. And the way you talked about the life of the language, that was quite astonishing. Thank you so much.